The feasts, the flames, the horns of triumph. This is the version of history that echoes through movies and sagas. The clamor of victory, the laughter of warriors swollen with mead, their halls filled with gold and spoils. But the true story began only when the fires of celebration died down. Victory was not measured in treasure alone. It was measured in human lives. For the Vikings, conquest was not random violence. It was systematic. And at the heart of this system were the women. Noble daughters, queens, and princesses. Taking them was not an afterthought. It was the strategy. To seize a woman of high lineage was to extinguish a dynasty. To strip her from her homeland was to erase bloodlines and shatter continuity. Armies could be rebuilt, halls reconstructed, but when women of power were taken, the foundation of entire societies was broken. The Irish coast in the year 821 provides one of the starkest glimpses into this. The annals of Ulster recorded the moment with chilling brevity. Étair was plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. No names, no cries, no record of lives lost. Just an entry, a ledger note. Women transformed into numbers, stripped of their humanity in the cold ink of history. They were dragged to longships, crammed as human cargo, treated as livestock bound for sale. The voyage itself was merciless. Hunger, storms, and despair claimed lives before the first market was reached. Those who survived were not greeted by freedom, but by chains. Dublin, Hedeby, Birka, these ports thrived not merely as centers of trade, but as vast markets of human flesh. In Dublin, one of the largest slave markets of Europe, a young, healthy woman might fetch 12 to 20 ounces of silver, the equivalent of a farmstead's yearly harvest. If she had skills in weaving, healing, or music, her price climbed higher. What once marked her nobility now increased her value as property. The market assessed her as carefully as a horse or a hawk, reducing her to an object of profit. From there, some were sold to Norse settlers in Ireland. Others disappeared into far-reaching routes, eastward through the rivers of the Rus into the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate, where slave economies demanded endless human fuel. Across seas and continents, noble women who once sat on carved thrones now labored in silence under alien skies. Their stories dissolved into anonymity. Their names erased. Their identities absorbed into the economic engine of the Viking world. The chronicles remembered battles, kings, and silver weighed in scales. They did not remember the faces of the women who became the true spoils of war. This was not glory. This was not the saga sung by poets. This was the hidden core of Viking expansion, a conquest not only of land, but of bodies, of lineage, of memory itself. Every victory feast ended with silence, and in that silence, the fate of women was sealed. And this is only the beginning. Because beyond the raids came something even darker, the full machinery of captivity, where human lives became the most profitable currency of the age. Before we step further into that story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's the best way to ensure these forgotten voices are not erased again. If the battlefield was the first act of conquest, the slave market was the second. Raiding alone could not sustain an empire. What gave the Viking world its real power was the transformation of captives into currency. And the captives who mattered most, the ones who brought the highest prices and the deepest humiliation, were women of status. The process was as calculated as it was brutal. In ports like Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka, the captured were brought ashore in chains, lined up for inspection like cattle. Their value was assessed with cold precision. A young woman in good health fetched 12 to 20 ounces of silver, enough to feed a family for years. Beauty increased the price. Skills increased it further. A woman who could weave fine cloth or mix medicines was not seen as a person with knowledge, but as a machine with profitable output. Merchants recorded transactions with the same tone they used for livestock. In their ledgers, humanity had no place. And from these ports, the network stretched far. Captives were trafficked east along the great rivers of the Rus, reaching Kiev and Novgorod, then pushed further into the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate, where demand for slaves was insatiable. In Constantinople, Irish and Anglo-Saxon women stood on the same auction blocks as Slavs and Persians, their lives woven into the invisible fabric of empires. Some stories survived, faint echoes of lives that were never meant to be remembered. One is the tale of Melkorka, the daughter of an Irish king, captured in a raid around the year 956. She was sold in Norway to Hoskold, a wealthy Icelandic chieftain, for an enormous sum, 24 ounces of silver, 3 times the price of a prime milk cow. She lived in his hall as a concubine, bearing him a son, and for years she refused to speak a single word. Everyone believed she was mute. But silence was her weapon. In a world that had stolen everything else, refusing to give her voice was her last act of defiance. Only when she was overheard teaching her son Gaelic did the truth emerge. She was royal, the daughter of King Muirchertach of Ireland. But even her revealed lineage did not free her. She remained in Iceland, a princess reduced to a concubine, her name remembered only because her son grew into power. For every Melkorka who was accidentally preserved in a saga, there were countless others erased entirely. The silence of these women is not an absence. It is the result of design. The Viking system thrived on stripping identity and remaking lives into commodities. The sagas, the annals, even the archaeology, they preserve the numbers, the silver weights, the routes of ships. But they bury the humanity. What emerges is not just cruelty, but a deliberate economy. A machine that fed itself on conquest, running on the bodies of the captured. And within this machine, women were both the most vulnerable and the most valuable. This was no accident of history. It was policy. It was profit. It was power. And yet, not all of these women submitted quietly. Some fought back in ways that shook the ground beneath their captors. The next part of this story belongs to them, the defiant, the desperate, and the doomed. Before we continue, remember, like this video and subscribe. It helps ensure these erased stories are heard, not just once, but for generations to come. Not every woman taken by the Vikings accepted silence. Some resisted, not with swords or shields, but with acts of defiance so desperate, so horrifying, that they became legend. Their stories reveal not submission, but the will to deny their captors the satisfaction of conquest. One of the most haunting examples is the Abbess of Coldingham, known as Ebb the Younger. In 870, when the great heathen army swept north, her monastery perched on the cliffs of Scotland was an inevitable target. The nuns inside knew what Viking raids meant. They had heard the stories: monasteries burned, priests butchered, women defiled. For these women, violation was worse than death. To them, it was not only the destruction of the body but the staining of the soul. So Ebb gathered her sisters together. And in that cold stone chapter house, she took a razor to her own face, slicing off her nose and upper lip in front of them all. Blood poured down her chin, but she stood firm. "Make yourselves monsters to the lust of the heathens," she commanded. One by one, the nuns followed her example, mutilating themselves in a final act of resistance. When the Vikings broke into the monastery, expecting terror and trembling victims, they were met instead with a hall of disfigured women. The invaders, robbed of the prize they sought, responded with fire. They barred the doors, stacked timber against the walls, and burned the monastery to the ground. The abbess and her sisters chose not between life and death, but between two kinds of death. They chose the fire. Others resisted not with self-destruction, but with dignity that turned them into bargaining chips. In 1011, Canterbury fell to the Danes after 20 days of siege. The city's leaders, archbishops, reeves, abbesses, were taken alive. The women of rank were not slaughtered like the common people. They were too valuable. They became hostages, pawns in the brutal politics of ransom. 4 months, they endured captivity, their lives measured in silver and promises. Archbishop Elfhe, taken with them, refused to allow a ransom for his own release, declaring he would not have the church's gold spent on his freedom. His defiance earned him a martyr's death, beaten to pieces by drunken raiders. The women, silent in the shadows of this brutality, survived only because their lives were part of a larger transaction. 48,000 pounds of silver paid the next year to buy peace. Their fates were signed not in blood, but in coin. These women stood at the crossroads of power and despair. Some chose mutilation and flame. Others endured the slow agony of captivity, reduced to bargaining tools in a game they did not choose to play. In both cases, their humanity was stripped away. They were remembered not as individuals, but as examples, either of piety, of resistance, or of ransom. And yet, beneath these stories lies a truth too easy to miss. Their defiance, whether through fire, silence, or endurance, was a rejection of the system that sought to erase them. In different ways, they denied the Vikings total victory. But for many others, there would be no chance for resistance. Their stories ended not in fire or ransom, but in silence, buried in tombs, burned into the soil, forgotten by design. Before we step into that silence and uncover the graves where these women's final truths lie, remember to like this video and subscribe. It's the best way to keep these stories alive. For every recorded act of defiance, there are countless stories that never found their way into the chronicles. They lie buried in the soil, hidden in bones, waiting for archaeologists to unearth their silence. The dead cannot speak, but their graves whisper truths that the sagas refuse to write. In 870, Dumbarton Rock, the stronghold of the kingdom of Strathclyde, endured a siege so brutal it lasted 4 months. Cut off from water, the defenders finally surrendered. What followed was one of the largest forced removals in Viking history. 200 longships carried away the people of the fortress, men, children, and above all, the noble women of the court. They were shipped to Dublin, their lives reduced to profit. Even kings were powerless. King Arthgal himself was later executed on foreign soil, while his wife and daughters vanished into the Viking slave economy. For them, surrender meant not survival, but commodification. The tombs themselves tell us how far this system reached. In Iceland, DNA studies reveal the brutal arithmetic of settlement. The majority of male settlers carried Norse blood, but up to 63% of women traced their maternal lines to Ireland and Scotland. They had not chosen to sail north. They had been taken. Behind every farmstead and every saga of heroic settlement lay the unspoken truth. Iceland was built on stolen women. Their voices were erased from the record, but their genetics tell the story the chroniclers would not. And then there is the Oseberg ship. Excavated in 1904, it is one of the most breathtaking finds of the Viking world, a magnificent vessel buried in Norway, filled with treasures fit for queens. 2 women lay inside. One was elderly, a figure of immense power, perhaps a priestess or a ruler. The other was younger, around 50, long believed to be a loyal servant buried beside her mistress. But modern science uncovered a darker possibility. Her DNA bore markers from regions near the Black Sea, far from Scandinavia. Her diet showed she had not always lived as a noblewoman. The truth is chilling. She may have been a foreign captive, raised to serve in the queen's household, and when her mistress died, her life was sacrificed to follow into the grave. Even in death, she remained property. The splendor of the burial was not hers. It was her mistress's. She was an offering, a possession displayed as proof of power. Bound in life. Bound in death. These graves and bones expose what the sagas concealed, that the Viking Age was not merely an age of exploration or conquest, but of erasure. Women were the invisible currency that fueled expansion. Their names are gone, their stories reduced to silver weights in ledgers. They were burned in monasteries, silenced in halls, shipped across oceans, buried in tombs that did not belong to them. This is the story history tried to forget. Not a saga of heroes, but a ledger of human loss. If you've stayed with us through this journey, remember, like this video and subscribe. Because telling these stories is not just entertainment. It is an act of remembrance. Every name erased deserves a voice, and every silence deserves to be broken. Together, we can keep the truth alive.